Okay, Chevra, so we'll get started. Be'ezras Hashem. I'm very much appreciating everybody who's come, so really it helps me be koveya, which is a hard thing for me, so happy to do it. So Be'ezras Hashem, we're going to go to a different place in the Rebbe's teachings this week. We're not going to be looking at the Shiurim on Torah's Chacham, although it's certainly going to be relatable to what we're discussing. We're going to be looking at Yuma Dehilula. Yuma Dehilula, the Yartzeit Shiurim that the Rebbe prints in many of the pamphlets, is incredible. It goes through the history of the tzaddikim. It typically defines or describes better the spiritual reality of that tzaddik's universe, whether it's Rav Melech of Lezhensk, who's connected to Malchus, versus Rav Zushu, who's connected to Yesoid, and it goes through their different shitas and why certain historical processes took place with them, and then it builds, based on the stories of these tzaddikim, important sugyos and being masber sugyos in Kabbalah, whatever it is, something that only the Rebbe is really doing. So this is, and now, in the Nishmas and Chadasin, so a lot of these teachings are referred to as Nishmas and Chadasin. Nishmas and Chadasin is obviously a phrase that's taken from the Kigavna piece in the Zohar, which we say V'kula Mesachim B'Nishmas and Chadasin, that comes Shabbos, and then Neshama Yisera, every soul is endowed with a new Neshama, Nishmas and Chadasin, which was really the recordings or the recollections of everything that the Rebbe had discussed on his walks to Shul, back from Shul, at the Sudos of Shabbos. And originally it was very terse, and then the Talmidim, it's a particular Talmud who is really malakate these things, and an incredible memory, obviously, but then not embellishing, but adding upon. If the Rebbe referenced the source, so it would build the source. And then if you bring in that source, you bring in the source that supports that source. So it's become more than it was originally, I believe. But what they did in the Beis Medrash, Baruch Hashem, is they've basically published now, I believe, the 4th volume of Nishmas and Chadasin al HaTorah. So now you can really just get the volumes on each and every parsha, and it includes the Yartzeit Shiurim as well included within it. Just a total full tour de force of the entire gamut of Torah, touching Pshat, Remez, Drash, Sod, Razin, Derazin, etc., etc. But here, this is...
Is it a hard volume?
These are hard volumes, yes. They're called Nishmas and Chadasin. They're very beautiful, and you can buy those at really probably any store. And so this Yuma Dehilula is based on the Yartzeit of the Chesed LaAvram, Rav Avram Azulai. Is today the Yartzeit of Rav Avram Azulai? At some point in this... What? It could have passed. It could have been over the weekend. I think it's usually, surprisingly or not surprisingly, it ends up very often Parshas Chayesara, because Rav Avram Azulai was buried. He lived in Hebron. He was the grandfather of the Chida. Famously, towards the end of his life, there was a story of a sultan who dropped his sword into Maras HaMachpelah. Rav Avram Azulai was sent down there. He encountered Avram Avinu, and they said, "It's nice to have you here. Unfortunately, or fortunately, once you're here, you're gonna remain here with us." And Rav Avram Azulai wrote the Chesed LaAvram. The Chesed LaAvram, the Rebbe spends a lot of time, is one of the first svarim that really attempted and succeeded in unifying two separate worlds of Kabbalah. That it was the Kabbalah of Rav Moshe Cordovaro, the Ramak, who preceded the Arizal in Tzfat, and the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Now, B'derech Klal, the Emek HaMelech brings it down, many Meforshim bring it down. There's almost like an Isser Shatness of learning the Kabbalah of the Ramak along with the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Why? Because the Kabbalah of the Ramak spoke in what the Emek HaMelech describes as Olam HaBlima, or really Tohu. Because what the Ramak was on a certain level, the Shita Mekubetzes, of all of the Mekubalim and the Rishonim and the Gaonim who preceded him, and Pardes Rimonim, in addition to all of the other Svarim that the Ramak wrote. He was an Ish Eloki, he was a person who tried to cultivate Ruach HaKodesh, he was a Bal HaZohar, Shein Kamohu, is 25 volumes on the Zohar HaKadosh. I'm going to forget the name. Something Yakar is the name of the Ramak's parish on the Or Yakar is the name of the Ramak's parish on the Zohar Kadosh. Pardes Rimonim is a compilation of shitos, aligning different shitos, and almost not paskening, but saying this is the shita that really kind of, is Keser considered Ein Sof? Is Keser considered a sphera that's different than Ein Sof, so to speak? Again, it never means what we think it means. We're never talking about Hashem b'chvodu v'atzmo, but the Rashash is machriya. Now, generally speaking, the Ramak did not have what we refer to as Chachmas HaPartzuf. The Arizal came along And one of the chidushim, the novelty of the Ari, was that he took all of these isolated points of information and created a system out of them. So that theoretically you have 10 points that the Ramak describes, which can be seen as 10 separate spheros. The Arizal comes along and says, no, these 10 points create a whole that is greater than the sum total of its parts, and that chachma of the parts of Yamin, Smol, and Emsa, of connectivity, of a balance, of a dialectic, of what's referred to in the Tzafar Ditzniusa as the mitkala, as the scale, and a balancing, developed idea out of the disparate parts, is referred to as the Kabbalah of Olam HaTikun, which is what the process of Tikun was, taking disparate, individualized parts and unifying them, and that's seen as the Kabbalah of the Arizal, which is in relationship to the Kabbalah of the Ramak, which might be referred to as Eitz Hadas Tovara. The Kabbalah of the Arizal is referred to as Eitz HaChaim. Now, you see that in many places, but what the Rebbe points out very clearly is that in the beginning, a person learns the Ramak. Then you learn the Arizal. And in the beginning, there's almost like an Isser Shatnez that you have to individualize and identify each zerem of thought, because the Ramak is much closer to taking the philosophers of Yiddishkeit and transforming them into Mekubalim. And what the Arizal is doing is, this is what the Mekubalim are saying. So it's a different mahalach. But after you learn the Arizal, what the Rebbe says is then you go back to the Ramak and you learn it, and then you realize that the Ramak and the Arizal not only are not in distinction to one another, but rather they're magala, a deeper light, which is why Rav Koenig used to say that in between the Kvarim of the Ramak and the Arizal is where the Neshama of the Baal Shem Tov is found. That the Baal Shem Tov is the bridge between the Kabbalah of the Ramak and the Kabbalah of the Arizal. Famously, there was a famous, not fake, but it was not real, but they discovered a Geniza. I think it was called the Geniza of Haraset, I believe. It was like a Lubavitcher discovery in Russia, and it's known as a ziyuf. But there were a lot of letters that were written in the name of the Baal Shem Tov that said that really the Mahalach of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh was to follow the Kabbalah of the Ramak, more importantly than the Kabbalah of the Arizal. What the Rebbe has pointed out is that the Rebbe says that we had a previous history of a ziyuf, right? The Besamim Rosh. It was Shilas and Shuvos of Harash, which turned out to be a ziyuf, and it was referred to as the Besamim Rosh. But we also have the Maharsham, who brings down a raya to a certain psak from the Besamim Rosh. So the Rebbe says that if something's a ziyuf, you don't learn a ziyuf. But if the tzaddikim brought the ziyuf lahalacha, then it's nesapech to halacha. So even if we don't accept the fact that the Kabbalah of the Baal Shem Tov is rooted in the Ramak, the Rebbe Rashab, Zchus Yigan Aleinu, felt that it was significant enough to value, so we see it. The Chesed LaAvram,
he was holding that, the Rashab was holding that he was there.
It was holding that, it was not the Besamim Rosh, but he was holding that Geniza was authentic. And even though later Tzaddikim and Lubavitch, the Rebbe Rayatz, I believe, I don't know the exact history, felt that he admitted that it wasn't, once the Rebbe Rashab appreciated the svara of something, it's nichlal into the emes. Thus is the koyach of the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov. But the Chesed Avram, the Rebbe points out, was one of the prototypes to be Meshalev, the Kabbalah of the Ramak and the Arizal. So this is coming from the Yuma de Hilula of the Chesed LaAvram. And the reason that this content is going to be related to that is because there's a teaching from the Chesed LaAvram, which is a hard, wonderful, beautiful sefer. It's a sefer that describes Svas as an Ir Miklat, and how the Or in Svas is an Or of Bina, which is why it's connected to Tzafon and hiddenness. But he describes the Maila of learning Iyun HaTorah. And he describes that Iyun HaTorah, real investment of the mind into the ideas, as opposed to just kind of collecting ideas, which is Bekius, that Iyun is not only for the purpose of understanding the Torah, but the Iyun itself is the Segula of the Torah. That by being ma'ayin in Torah, not only is it for the purpose of understanding, but when I am ma'ayin with my mind, that is the tachas of Liman Torah, that my mind is transformed into a vessel of Torah, which is a profoundly relevant idea, especially when looking at Lumdus in general, because what Rav Chaim Brisker and the tzaddikim of that mahalach have done is really show that it's not so much about the content of the idea, but the context in which you think the idea, that svara hayeshera, or the Lumdus, the abstractive thought that you're applying to Chazal, it doesn't doesn't matter if this is what the Rambam meant. If it's Svari Yeshera, it becomes a Cheftza of Torah itself. And so what the Chesed LaAvram is very much, it's a prototype of that idea. So we're going to look at tonight from the Rebbe is I believe it's an incredible idea. It's one of my favorite ideas. And we'll see a little bit of what Iyun means, and then take that idea of the Rebbe about what Iyun means and apply it to the psychological and spiritual life of an individual. So the Rebbe says as follows. Biur derech limud ha'iyun karoi. What does it mean to learn Iyun properly? And I'm going to leave Iyun untranslated because Iyun can mean very different things to many people. But one source to look at for Iyun, which I think is aligned very much with the Brisker Mahalach in Iyun as well, is the Mittler Rebbe, the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, in his Shar HaYichud Ve'Hamuna. In Shar HaYichud, Rav Hillel Paracher wrote a Perush on Shar HaYichud where the first few pages is going into what Iyun and Ha'amakas Hadas is, and why his Boinunus has two nuns, and it's a very, very instructive place to understand what the tzaddikim are saying about Iyun. So Zak the Rebbe, V'herich marenu b'malas limad ha'iyun. And the Rebbe spends a lot of time, the Rebbe spent a lot of time talking about the value of studying something b'Iyun. Shehat tzaddikim samchu b'limudam, that the righteous found joy in their studies when? Kishihigiu l'makom shelo hivinu hapshat o shahaisa lahem ezakushya. The tzaddikim were excited when? Not when they understood things clearly, but specifically when they encountered a fold in the sugya, when they encountered a difficulty, when their minds were caught up in something and they no longer had the pshat. Shekol zman shemevinim hakol, that as long as I understand everything, i'efshar li chanes la'avodas ha'iyun va'omek ha'machshava. I don't have the ability or the necessity, which is the birthplace of ability, to descend deeply into the depth of my thought. Ach kishalom mevinim, but when I don't understand, when there's a necessity to dig deeper, yucholim lahatzchil lachshav la'ayin. It's specifically at that point, the difficulty is the birthplace of thought and exploration. She'inyan ha'iyun hu, what does Iyun mean? Ikuv hamachshava b'nekuda achas. It is the arresting of the flowing nature of my thoughts to focus on one particular item. To stop the movement, the perpetual, ever-flowing nature of thinking, which is moving perpetually, infinitely, and to stop it and focus in on one particular nekuda. The lachsor shuv b'shuv b'machshava amuka al makom hamukshalo. And not only to stop my thought, but to return again and again and again to the place that my mind has gotten caught up on. Ad she niftach haterutz v'neskala ha'or panimi shel hasugya. To the extent that by being misboinen again and again and again, and returning back again and again and again to that area of thought, not allowing my mind to go in the natural sway of things to take me infinite miles away, but to use the koyach of gevura, of richus hamachshava, to focus on one particular point, then memela, the kushya, is the opening to the heart of the sugya. Now, I'm reading into the Rebbe now. It's not explicit, but I imagine that the Rebbe is working here also with the Mahalach of Rabbi Nachman, where the kushya is not simply the step before the teretz, but the kushya itself becomes the very site from which the teretz emerges. Rabbi Nachman says in Sefer Amidos that by Erech Shtika, that it's very good when a person finds their machshavos to have many questions and a sugya on the Rebbeinu Shalom, whatever it might be, to be shoytek, to be silent and to sit with those questions until they find that the questions themselves offer the answers necessary to those questions. Rabbi Nachman also expresses that kushya, that kasha, asking a kasha, is Roshei Tevos Shema Hashem Koli Ekra. That Hashem, hear my voice, I'm crying out to you. That hidden within the very question itself, says Rabbi Nachman, it's very possible that one will come to find the answer to the problem that they're encountering. Or like the words of the Rishonim, that She'ilas Chacham Chatzi Tshuva, that the question of a wise person is already the beginning of an answer. And so over here, by sitting with the question, Memela, the answer will begin to emerge if I can properly understand the question. But the ikar of Iyun is to be ma'amid al davar echad, to stop the thoughts from flowing, and to focus. Again, very similar and very in line with modern concepts of mindfulness, which means to arrest the flow of thought and to focus on one particular The way of the mind is to run forward and to flow like water without any arrested development. And what a person needs to train themselves to do is to train their mind to slow itself down, to stop the thought, to prevent itself from moving forward, and to stick with one point. The Leshem Shua V'Chaloma surprisingly says that Gar, Chachma, Bina, and Das, which we typically identify as loving kindness and expressivity in relationship to the dinim and the gvuros of the lower spheros, are in fact shemos of Elohim. So why are they shemos Elohim if that represents din? Because Zok the Leshem, that the main strength of thought is to be like a machitza shel barzel, is to be like a bronzen wall that blocks out the flow of other thoughts. That the goal of thinking is to quiet down the ever-present noise of the mind until I can stand upon one small nakuda. Because we don't have ever an empty mind. The mind is never empty. Adrab, the mind is full, it's bustling, it's buzzing with infinite thoughts. Right? The Piasatz Rebbe Hashem Yom Kamdoma writes in his diary in Savaziras that if a person were to actually record what was going through their mind for an hour of any given day, they would find themselves to be in line with the greatest sinner as well as the greatest saint. There's no distinction. The mind is perpetually flowing. Thinking, the act of thinking, or the act of Iyun, is lahepach, is to arrest the flow of thought and to force myself to stick with one thing and one thing in particular. And a person needs to train themselves in this. Shazel b'chinas avodas ha'iyun. This is what it means to learn be'iyun. V'lo kamo hatoyim, and this is like a real taina on those who, I'm not one of those, but those who are still, learning in the derech ha'iyun that we see in certain yeshiva systems or whatever it is. Lo kamo hatoyim shalimud ha'iyun hu iyun b'harbe meforshim rishonim v'achronim. Not in the way that a person thinks Iyun is to just learn all of the achronim and the rishonim on the sugya. Shezeh b'chinas b'kiyas b'meforshim. That's a b'kiyas and meforshim. Right? Ela ha'iyun hu dafka lihi atzer l'meshach zman l'nukuda achas bilvad. But rather, real Iyun is stopping on one particular point. Rav Hutner famously, when Machon Yerushalayim wanted to print the Otzer Meforshei HaTalmud, right, the Green Monsters, the first volume was Chala, and Rav Hutner was the Nasi of Machon Yerushalayim at that time. So Rav Buxbaum, who was a big promoter of publishing Torah, and he also is responsible, I believe, for building the Breslov in Shari Chesed, which is a tremendous schus also. But Rav Hutner said, "You want me to write a haskama to this?" He said, "The Chazon Ish said that Iyun is dead in our generation. The only thing left is chipus. The only thing left is searching out the makoros that discuss the sugya." So he said, "You're asking me to take away the last element," but it was Rav Hutner, so he still did it anyway, right? It was like a shtick to kedusha, right? He's saying it's not a good thing to do, and then he signed off on it. But the reason he signed off on it was because he quoted the Slobodker saying as follows: that in Hoidu what we praise Hakadosh Baruch Hu for is creating the sun and the moon and arranging the sun and the moon. And the Slobodker would ask, why two levels of praise? Elamah, we see that there's praise for creation, and there's praise for nice arrangement as well. So at least what we have here is a bracha on nice arrangement. But in the end of the day, what the Rebbe is saying is that Iyun is not searching out every maforish in the mahalach of raid, which is a lot of fun, that's bekiyas b'maforshim. Iyun is mamish sitting with an idea over and over. And the Rebbe adds that I believe in one of the yeshivas he was learning in, the Rebbe learned in a lot of yeshivas, it could be Gateshead, it could be Meir, it could be, Camp Aguda, but he said there was one bacher who, in preparation for the Shir Iyun, everybody else was looking at the Meforshim. Everybody else was searching, the Rav Shimon Shkaps and the Rav Baruch Bears. This person would sit quietly with no sefer. He would learn a few lines of Gemara, maybe look at a Tosfos, and sit there, eyes closed, just contemplating the sugya from every imaginable direction. And that was his hakdama, and that was his hachana for the Shir itself. So what we see is that Iyun is a richus hamachshavos. It's a utilization of the strength of Gevura, of being mitzamsem the mind and not allowing it to express itself further. So skipping one os where he goes into discussing a particular chavrusa shaft that he had with Rav Kaufman, who is a Rav in England, I believe, where there would be absolutely no conversation whatsoever, not before the learning, not after the learning, but only learning. And the Rebbe said that he was makabel from that place, real Iyun ha'amiti, to understand that all a person should be thinking about when they're osek in Torah is Torah itself. He said the only time that this chavrusa was interrupted for anything else was that when Rav Kaufman was on a trip, he read a Sefer Hasidim that said a person is going to be nitveh la'asilavo, that it's not about what your mind was capable of learning, but it's about what effort you put into learning. So if you have an easy time learning, that's not going to save you from the din of being called out for not putting enough effort in. And this Rav, before he sat down with the Rebbe to learn, he said, this is a really intense Sefer Hasidim, and then he continued learning. He said that was like the only interruption he made. But the Rebbe continues and brings it l'derech ha'avoda. B'hoisif, and the Rebbe adds now, Shederach zed limud ha'iyun, learning iyun in this way, arresting my thought, not allowing my mind to flow with the natural fluidity of itself, and rather to focus on one particular inyan at this point. Poiseches es ha'adam lahaknisa el advekas b'Hashem yisparach shutzliya gamkein b'nekudazu. What this prepares an individual to do is also to be davak to the Rabbanu Shalom in their minds, which is also dependent on this very same strength, which is quieting down the mind from all of the various noises and the differentiations and the distractions, and focusing in on one particular nakuda. Why? That a person learns the power of preventing their mind from wandering wherever it wants to wander and simply floating in the air. Lahapshit oso mikol hadvarim hachitzoniim, and to abstract it and to clear it away from all of the external casings of thought, hamatridim oso, that are distracting the person or bothering them, ad sha'alidei hahapshata mikol hadvarim hachitzoniim, that through removing myself from all of the external inessential thoughts that are covering what I really want to be thinking about, v'ha'esrachsus b'nekuda achas, so it's not only tzur meira, which is quieting down all of the other distracting thoughts, but it's also asay tov, which is descending down deeply and being mitzayachid with this one thought in my mind right now. At that point, the mind is beginning slowly but surely to be davak to the Torah. Now, the Rebbe doesn't quote it here, but this is what the Balatanya and what the Nefesh HaChaim describe, either in Shar Dalid or in Perek Dalid from Tanya, about the yichud hanifla inherent in Limud Torah. That only in Limud Torah does a person have such a yichud where the mind is both surrounded by and surrounding the thing that I'm trying to connect to. And that's only through hisrachsus hadas, by closing off the mind to all external thoughts and focusing in on one nekuda hapnimis. And the Rebbe continues, ukisha misraglim bazeh, and when a person learns to become habituated in this, to stop their thoughts and focus on one thought, which is very possible, right? In the beginning, let's say l'dugma lahavdil, a person wants to practice 15 minutes of mindfulness, right? And mindfulness, let's say, is going to be the ability to focus in on one particular thought, choose your thought that you want to focus on, to the exclusion of the fluidity of all other thoughts. So for the 15 minutes that a person is going to be doing that, the likelihood is that the first 14 and a half minutes are going to be spent deferring unwanted thoughts, machshava zaros, that are now upset that I'm pretending to be in charge of my thinking. They're going to say, who does this person think he is to be in charge of their thought? But those 14 and a half minutes that are spent acknowledging the vagrant thought and returning back to the essential thought are training the mind to slowly but surely focus in on one particular thought at this given moment. And kishemis raglim bazeh, when I become habituated in this, yichayla hamachshava lihichanes la'omek yoter, then my mind can descend down even deeper. Ad shepoiteches es gilui ha'or ha'elokisha b'Torah HaKadoshah, until my mind is so davak to this one nekuda that I'm learning, where everything else is removed, that I begin to taste of the light, the Or HaGanuz that's hidden within the Torah, v'zoicha hanefesh li davik b'kel chai. And at that point, like the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh says, like the Vilna Gaon and his Talmidim say, the Iker Dveikus is through Limud HaTorah. Does that mean Yediyas HaTorah? Some will say so. But what the Rebbe is pointing out, it's his Davkus HaMachshava b'soich HaTorah, by being so saturated with this one particular thought that nothing else exists in reality. V'zoicha hanefesh li davik b'kel chai. The Siper, and the Rebbe said that this is what the Admor HaEmsai would tell his Chasidim to do, la'asoik b'hispoinenus, to spend a lot of time just practicing contemplating one thought, a focus on it. The Mittler Rebbe would very often say, before giving over Mamre Chasidus, it was silent, and the Mittler Rebbe, they say this about the Rebbe Rashab as well, but the Mittler Rebbe would be heard saying, Shah, 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 Shah. And they would ask, they said, Rebbe, no one's talking right now. And what the Mittler Rebbe said is he's talking to his own mind. He's trying to quiet down the zramim and the flowing fluidity of thoughts, like the Rechovas Anar, to focus in on one particular thought at that moment. Yeah.
Sounds a lot like techniques of meditation.
Very much so. Very much so. Yeah, Limud HaTorah Lishma is, I think meditation here is the borrowed term, meaning Iyun.
Yeah,
Iyun is the essential. Iyun is the pathway towards ha'amaka sadas. It's not an expansion of thought. It's not a hisravcha sadas. It's not even ha'aracha sadas, which is identifying all of these various mashalim. But ha'amaka sadas through Iyun is looking at that one nakuda and opening it up layer after layer after layer, returning back to it. So it's very much a meditative process.
Someone who comes from the Torah later in life doesn't grow up with this and doesn't grow up in any shape with learning the Iyun. They come to it from they learn some meditation techniques, then apply that to this one.
I think so.
It's
Yeah.
parallel.
I think it's very parallel. The only difference, and I can't speak from a position of being experienced in meditation whatsoever, but my impression is that meditation is less focused on insight. I mean, there are meditative practices that are insight focused, where a person is trying to draw down new understanding. But generally speaking, at least the way I conceive of meditation is more of a presence with the thought, as opposed to in Iyun, where you're trying to uncover a truth underneath sheaths of untruth, so there is a goal. It's still the purpose of uncovering a truth that might not have been present beforehand.
I remember when I took a class in Jewish meditation about 11 years ago when I first came here. There's a rabbi, can't remember his name.
Okay.
Ophir, not Ophir, in Old City, in Jerusalem.
Okay.
He was giving me an all-day workshop on Jewish meditation. And whereas I had learned in transcendental meditation, stuff that was kind of, down later was kind of not supposed to be done, you could still say, you could focus like on the hey of Hashem.
Right.
Okay?
Absolutely.
And picture that and try to understand
Absolutely.
that. That would be your focus.
Absolutely.
It would be almost like a mantra.
Very much so.
But as opposed to trying to understand an
Iyun, right. Iyun is trying to understand the sugya. It's not, what the Rebbe is describing here is that if you train yourself enough to learn Iyun and to be not even in control, but to be able to utilize the tools of quieting down the mind, then it could be applied to Dveikus also. But the Dveikus is not separate and apart from the Limud HaTorah. For the Rebbe and for all tzaddikim, meaning someone once said they saw pictures of the Rebbe on like a trip to America, that he was makabel kahal, he was accepting people, and he had a Gemara open in front of him. And someone said, wow, it's so nice, it's amazing that the Rebbe, in between seeing people and giving brachos, was learning Gemara. But by the Rebbe, it's very different. He's learning Gemara, and while learning Gemara, he's doing all of these things. For the Rebbe, and for other tzaddikim, I imagine as well, the Gan Eden, and not just, my Gan Eden is sitting with the Shtender and the Ran on Adarim, but mamish, when learning Gemara, it's Gan Eden. That entering into the osios, and to the words, and to the potency inherent within the letters, and contemplating the ideas is quite literally dveikus with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the Torah itself. So I think it's a very important point that this is, the Rebbe is saying that do this enough and you'll learn to apply it to practice in spirituality as well.
It's true humility, even.
Mamish humility.
It's right to the humility.
It goes directly to bittul.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're mavata yourself to the or in the Torah.
Wow.
The Torah is the ikr. The Torah HaKadosh, the Rashash says at the end of Hakdamas Rechavas Hanar, that the kav or ein sof, the descent of infinite light into this world, is in and of itself the Torah. Meaning to say the Torah itself is the way that we relate to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is what the Baal Tanya and the Nefesh HaChaim describe at length. Baal Tanya says, what are you going to say? You're going to say, I didn't touch the king, I only touched his clothes. The clothes of the king is the king. The Torah is the expression of the das of HaKadosh Baruch Hu prior to any limitation. And so learning it brings a person face to face with bittul. So the Rebbe continues. And he said that there were certain Talmidim of the Mitler Rebbe who were able to be misboinein. They were able to spend time contemplating a single thought for Sheva Sha'os Ritzufos, for 7 hours straight, which again, in the world of, meditation or hisbonenus, it's not such a chiddush even. There are people, I remember reading somebody's book about a Baal Tshuva who spent, he said, 15 hours in it, unaware that he was having a seizure, like insane things. But the mind is capable, And so the Rebbe says, and this is going to bring it lamaisa. Haderach lahamtik moichen de katnus. So what we're learning now about Iyun, what we're learning about quieting down the mind and focusing in on the particular point at the heart of all things, is also the way that a person comes to sweeten moichen de katnus, small-mindedness, right? In Kabbalah and Chassidus, in the Torah HaKadosha, in a person's life, there's two experiences, which really comprise infinite levels of experience, but really it can be comprised into two. There's moichen de katnus and there's moichen de gadlus. Moichen de katnus is when a person finds themselves in a state of constriction, where the mind is caught. where the self is caught, where I can't break free from whatever it is that's holding me down, whether it's because my mind is populated with issues or unwanted thoughts, depending on whether I'm a Makubal or whether I'm a Talmud of the Baal Shem Tov. Each person understands Moichin de Katnus in their own way. For myself, Moichin de Katnus means any moment of stuckness in a person's life, any encounter with constriction where things are not moving, things got stuck, things got arrested, and I can't move through it, I can't turn back, I can't go to the left, I can't go to the right. Very similar to kind of Bilam's expression, I couldn't go there, I couldn't go here, I'm stuck in the narrow straits, right? I'm stuck in that place. Moichin de Gadlus is an openness, right? The expansivity of consciousness, a mature consciousness, which allows me to move forward, which allows me to understand things in a different way. So Katnus and Gadlus, all of the synonyms that you can imagine are applicable, right? Katnus is darkness, Katnus is smallness, Katnus is exile, Gadlus is grandiosity, not grandiosity in an arrogant way, but bigness, expansivity, geula. So what happens? How are we mamtik moichin de Katnus? In Kabbalah and Hasidus, and this is an essential nakuda, the job is not to get rid of moichin de Katnus, right? You try and get rid of moichin de Katnus, you try and repress moichin de Katnus, you try and suppress it or pretend it doesn't exist, it will affect you even more harshly later on. The job is to be mismoided with it, to face it, to be aware of it, and to transform it. Right, to elevate it, to force Moichin de Katnus to become part and parcel of your spiritual experience. And we're going to see at the end how this is all very much makusher to the Torah's Chacham, who we've been discussing over the past few weeks, Rav Chaim de la Rosa.
At the same time, you're trying to not ignore it, but to at least focus on it.
Engage in. No. So we'll see. The Rebbe is saying that this way of thinking also is a way of being mamtik Moichin de Katnus. So let's see. So v'kishar Iyyun, any kasha is moichin de Katnus also in a sugya. Anytime I encounter a difficulty in a sugya that I need a beer on, that can be conceived as moichin de Katnus in relationship to the teretz, which is moichin de Gadlus. Right, that state of confusion prior to clarity is moichin de Katnus in relationship to moichin de Gadlus also. Kishra Iyyun el parsha, and what the Rebbe did is he connected this idea to the parsha. Shine derech zu hi derech lahamtik es koil ha-moichin de Katnus sheba'olam. This mahalach of Iyun, this mahalach of focusing on one particular thought, of being oitzer my machshava from running anywhere it wants, and hyper-focus on one particular point, this is the way to be mamtik, to sweeten the katnus in our lives and in the world. Shekoil ha-moichin de Katnus. What is moichin de Katnus? What is moichin de Katnus? Hem kedei la'azor la'adam sheyachal achshav lichanes li'amed ata an nukuda achas shebetorah kadosha. Moichin de Katnus, frustrations, interruptions, difficulties in our lives are just an opportunity to learn how to focus on one thing in its isolation. When I have a problem, my mind is hyper-focused on that problem. It's very difficult to think about anything positive that's going on when I'm focused on my problem. If there's one kid who's upset, it's hard to focus on the kids who are doing well. If there's been 10 good days, one good day takes it away. One bad day takes it away. In a state of moichin de Katnus, it's very difficult to think about anything other than that. Shekivan shemoichin shaloi nimsoim bebechinas Katnus. When a person's mind is in a state of smallness, yachol ata yoter bekalus latzor lisakev lachzor shuv v'shuv al nekuda achas. When a person's mind is small, when a person's mind is caught up, what we find ourselves doing is we're ruminating over and over on one particular thought. And if a person is already ruminating over and over on one particular thought, then it's a much easier transition to applying that to the Torah HaKadosha. Right? Chazal have already given anxiety methods of coping with anxiety, which is you're anxious, go to the base measure. So if my mind is hyper-focused on a particular issue, so okay, my mind is already ruminating on one particular thought, let me apply that to something in the Torah. Let me apply that to a pasuk that I can perpetually ruminate over, like the Piasetzner Rebbe Hashem Yimkom Doma describes in the Inyan of Hashkata, of repeating something over and over and over and over and over and over again. And katnus brings us to that place, because katnus, constriction, is that when this problem is in front of me, it's all that exists, nothing else exists. And that's the very same midah we have to learn when it comes to being mamtik katnus, of learning that the only thing that exists is this nikud in the Torah right now.
The Leibus said that his rabbi told him that whenever he has an issue, he should go learn Gemara B'Iyun.
Kavaldik. Right, it's mamtik all the dinim. The Yid HaKadosh said that there's no greater hachana for tefillah. Forget mikvah, forget that. Learning Gemara Rashi Tosas B'Iyun. It's matahir the mind completely. It's matayr the mind completely. Va'az, and at that point, when a person learns how to transform the hyper-focus of their mind on that negative thing to the hyper-focus of the mind on one point of spirituality, az yahapech ha-moichen de katnus. At that point, the moichen de katnus are transformed. The moichen de katnus are what? It's our malchus. It's our state of concealment prior to fullness. It's the state of potential prior to actualization. At that point, the katnus is transformed. L'shar v'knisa el hadvekas b'Hashem yisbarach. Every difficulty becomes a gateway through which I can walk through and connect to God. Because right now my mind is hyper-focused, and let me just transform the hyper-focus on the problem to the hyper-focus on God within the problem. It's not even demanding that we forget about the problem and think about God. That's being very firm about it. Adrabah, stay with the problem, but uncover God in the problem. This is what the Kamarna Rebbe said, based on the Baal Shem Tov. Right? He says that Kisha Adam Yodea, when a person comes to recognize that Alufa Shel Olam, that the creator of the world is hidden within all of the Hastara, Miyad Yispardu Kol Playavan. At that moment, all of the difficulty is transformed. Because I've transformed my das from thinking about the problem to thinking about the Rabbeinu Shalom. Al yedei sheyitzamtzem es kol hamoichin. I'm mitzamtzem my mind. I'm not thinking about anything but what is right in front of me right now. This is the nekuda of dveikus. Ubazeh yizke sheyahapech al yedei zeh kol hakatnus legadlus. And through this, I can transform the katnus itself into gadlus. Ve'es kol hastaros legiluyim, and all concealment into revelation. Again, this is a klal gadol. Whether this is what the Rebbe means to imply here, it's certainly contained within the text. The general way we think is that there's katnus that needs to be gotten rid of, and then godless needs to be drawn down in its place. The problem is there, the problem needs to be gotten rid of, and I need to draw down a solution into the place of the problem. In Kabbalah, in accordance with Hasidus, this is Mefurash in the Rashash as well, that we generally think that there's broken vessels that need to be clarified, and as a result of clarifying those broken vessels, I get to draw down divine consciousness. There's birurim, and then there's moichin. But what the Chazdei David says and what the Rashash says is that, no. It's not two separate things. The birurim, the broken thing you're dealing with right now, you work through it, you elevate it through all the worlds and all of the partsufim, you bring it back up to Orient Sof Kavyachol, and then you draw down the very same content that you just worked so hard bringing back up to be fixed, you draw it back down, but now in the guise of a fixedness. Which means that the problem is not separate and apart from the cure, the problem is the birthplace of the cure. The kasha is the birthplace of the terrorists. This is a very significant nakuda in the sense that the problem when a person encounters katnus, it's not, oh my gosh, I need to get out of this katnus or this hastara in order to find salvation. I need to learn how to be metapa with the katnus and to bring it, to live with it, to be with it until it gets transformed into the site of encountering godliness. The Rebbe here, this is one of my favorite teachings from the Rebbe actually. Say that again?
Just a quick clarification so I can understand.
Sure.
When you say to bring the godliness into the katnus, right, does that mean to say everything that happens that seems to be a problem is minishing life, or am I getting that wrong?
It's one way.
Okay.
It's one mahalach, meaning hamtakas adinim, hashkacha pratis. Sure, no, it's hashkacha pratis. Bitachon. Bitachon is certainly, bitachon is a shurish of hamtakas adinim. But again, then bitachon has different clarifications. But yes, whatever it is that helps the person through that process is what it means. That's what I believe. Right? I remember I was speaking somewhere once, and there was a woman who came over to me, and it was a terrible tzara. Just a crazy tzara, and she sat there because I spoke about Hasidus. She felt I was like an appropriate person to ask about how she can be makasher to the soul of her recently deceased husband at a young age. And the only thing I was able to answer was, whatever is comforting to you is what the Torah says. I could have been wrong on that, but that's what I wanted, that's what I felt. So yeah, so if that's the mahalach and being mamtik the din, then that's the way a person is mamtik the din. But any thought that is in line with kind of a reasonable perspective of faith that one has received from a teacher or from the Torah is how we're mamtik dinim. Each person has their own process in hamtakas dinim. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So the Rebbe says as follows. This is a teaching that he's brought down numerous times, and I think it's one of my favorite for sure. The Rebbe has had many Rebbeim in his life. Rav Yankel of Peshvorsk, whose yahrzeit it is, I believe, tomorrow, was from Antwerp, was one of the Rebbe's kind of main mashpiyim. The Rebbe spent a year with him. There was Chavivus ad Lahaflia. Another one of the Rebbe's Rebbeim was Rav Moshe Rosenbaum of Kretschnev, one of the recent, not the most recent, but one of the more recent Kretschnefer Rebbeim. The Chiddush of Rav Moshe Rosenbaum was that he was mamish obsessed with Hasidus Chabad. Was very much a student of, the Balatanya in terms of learning. So the Rebbe was makabel a lot, it seems, from him. Meaning, again, the Rebbe was makabel from people, but nobody made... Tzaddik is a tzaddik, right? They're tzaddik because they're a tzaddik.
The recording stopped on this.
Okay, but stay there. And so... Let's go. But yours is
I think it should be
okay. Stay there. So the Rebbe says as follows. He tells a Maisa of an encounter with his Rebbe, the Kretschnefer, when he was experiencing Sweetening Katnut, which really comes back and shows exactly what we're discussing.
Who's experiencing
The Rebbe, Rav Itche Meir. Be'erchen, whatever it means, right? So V'siper, and the Rebbe said over, Shapam keshahaisa lo ezet kufa kasha. It was a time where he was having a difficult time, and he found himself in the state of katnus hamoichin. And he went into his Rebbe, the Kretschnefer Rebbe. Said, Rebbe, I'm experiencing a tremendous level of katnus hamoichin. And the Kretschnefer Rebbe responded to him, who told you there's such a concept as katnus hamoichin? Where are you getting this idea from? That katnus hamoichin, you're in a state of small-mindedness. Who said that that's a thing? He started learning Tanya with him. And the Rebbe continued to learn Tanya with him to the point that he escaped from that katnus for a long time. The Hizbir Morena, and the Rebbe said, we have to try and understand this. What was the Kretschnefer Rebbe's point? What was his point when he said, who told you there's such a thing as katnus hamoichin? We know this is an explicit concept in the Baal Shem Tov, in the Arizal, v'chein, and furthermore, re'inu b'chush. We see that we know what katnus hamoichin is. I don't need a raya to this. I know what it means to be in a state of constricted mindfulness. Ella, so what did the Kretschnefer Rebbe mean? Shekavnaso haisa demi amar sheyesh la'asos mitzias nefredes me katnus hamoichin. Who told you to take katnus hamoichin and make it something separate and apart from your path in spirituality? Who told you that katnus hamoichin is some state of being disconnected from the Rabbeinu Shalom? Shebe'emes ein la'asos mimena betzias b'fnei atzmo. Don't make katnus hamoichin something out of itself. Don't give it its own most existence. Kilu, it's something separate from connection. Shirak bechinas pesach v'derech lichanes l'dargin shel dveikus. All katnus hamoichin is a gate through which a person can enter into a state of dveikus in Hashem Yisbarach. And this is what the Kretschnefer Rebbe was trying to show in his shir with Tanya. That don't think that katnus hamoichin is the opposition to connectivity. It's just another way of connectivity. And this is what I want to get into as the last nakuda from the Taras Chacham. Like we've spoken about so much about the Taras Chacham, Rav Chaim de la Rosa, what he shows us through the klal of Erchin and through the different ways that we look at reality, he says that Ein sila kamoichin la'olam. The Taras Chacham has a famous shita. There's no such thing as the removal of godly consciousness. We find in the Arizal numerous places. Sfiras HaOmer. We all know from Sifrei Chasidus, Leil Pesach comes, Gad L'Sheni comes, we experience all of the greatness. But then, because we didn't earn it, it disappears from us, and we have to earn it back from Sfiras HaOmer till Shavuos, and then comes Shavuos, we earn it again through earning. So there's a musag in the Arizal of Sila Kamoichin. There's a departure of mindfulness. There's a departure of divine awareness. But we also have a klal gadol revealed in the Arizal that anytime kedusha expresses itself, it leaves a roshim, tzadik hayotzim and ir nas a roshim, which means that in truth there's no actual departure, but it always leaves a trace. So what the Taras Chacham says is that be'emes ein silak moichin la'olam. There's no removal of godliness ever, except in relationship to the next level, it feels as if what I had gained spiritually pales in comparison to what I can now gain in the future. So Ein Sila Kamoichin means that a person is never going down. A person might now be facing a new opportunity in front of them in relationship to the next level. Where I'm standing right now appears to be deficient because now I look at something bigger, but it's not that I've lost anything, God forbid. There's no loss whatsoever. Everything is filled and subsumed with the light of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And what the Torah Chacham says is that, so how do we understand Katnus HaMoichin? Katnus HaMoichin is not the departure of Moichin. Katnus HaMoichin is Moichin. It's divine consciousness. It's my neshama being poel. It's my mind being illuminated and aligned with reality, but it just so happens to be revealed by way of Katnus. It's a very big difference to call Katnus HaMoichin the absence of conscious connection to God versus calling Katnus HaMoichin connection through your consciousness to God, but the connection at this point feels like Katnus. It's very different. From the perspective of actual Katnus HaMoichin, I'm left bereft of anything, and I can just wallow in my pity and not have anything for myself. But from the perspective of the Torah's Chacham, a person is never empty. There's always mochin. And it's never a question of degradation, but always a question of the next stage of elevation. So this Iyun, the Sakdama to Iyun, of choosing one idea to focus on. Look, the Balei Musar did this, the Balei Chasidus did this, to contemplate one particular idea over and over and over, and to be ma'amik b'das, and to overcome the all-too-human need to know more and cover ground, and to know more and more and more and more, in order to kind of stuff our bags with kind of information, rather to focus on one Nekuda Pnimis. Because like we saw in the Rebbe, in the Torah's Chacham, and as we'll continue to see, the entire Torah is saying one thing. Each and every person has their own Nekuda in Torah, and every part of the Torah is conveying that one singular point. So it's not so much about covering ground ba'oirech u'berochev, which is true also. A person needs to be a baki in all things. Like Rabbi Nachman says, a person has to be like a prince who travels to every possible country and takes in the sights and the sounds, so that in the future they can say, yeah, I've been there, I've been in that book, I've been in that book. But the ikar is to be oiches on one Nekuda in the mind, for a person to be able to find some comfort from within the Katnus HaMoichin itself. Be'ezras Hashem. Okay, Yashakaya Chevra.